Thank you, Professor Das. We are moving on to the continuity of this discussion because the entire panel is planned in that way. Thank you for setting the note for the very theme that we are going to explore. I am handing it over to Cecil. Professor Cecil Malaspina is with us. She will be hearing this session. Cecil, are you here? We have two speakers here, Professor Stefan Ecks from University of Edinburgh and Professor Arka Chattopadhyay from IIT. Cecil, are you here? This session will be moderated by Professor Saurabhi Bhattacharya, one of my dear colleagues.
Should I begin the session or should we wait for Cecil?
Yeah. I am handing it over to you and Cecil, but Cecil, can you turn on your video and microphone? Yeah, I think Saurabhi, you can start. I am seeing by and also Professor Arka is also here, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I shall begin then.
Yeah.
Okay. So a very good afternoon to all. We are here now to begin the third plenary panel of our conference. The panel has been titled as Rethinking Humanities and Its Outside, Negotiating the Science Question. I'd like to take the opportunity to first welcome Dr. Cecil Malaspina, who is chairing this session. Dr. Malaspina is also our keynote speaker for tomorrow, and I request all of you to be present for that. To introduce Dr. Malaspina briefly, she is Directeur de Programme, Collège International de Philosophie, Paris, and also a visiting fellow at King's College, London. So we welcome Dr. Malaspina as the chair and discussant for this plenary session. Now, the plenary session has been graced by two esteemed speakers. First, we have among us Dr. Stefan Ecks, who shall deliver a talk on an outline of a theory of embodied value. Now, to introduce Dr. Stefan briefly, he is senior lecturer and co-founder of the Medical Anthropology program of Edinburgh University. He is also the director of the post-graduation teaching program of the School of Social and Political Sciences, Edinburgh University. His areas of specialization include medical anthropology, medical pluralism, anthropology of pharmaceuticals, anthropology of food, and transcultural psychiatry. He did ethnographic fieldwork in India, Nepal, and the UK. His recent works explore value in global pharmaceutical markets, changing ideas of mental health in South Asia, poverty and access to healthcare, as well as multi-morbidity. Some of his publications include Eating Drugs, Psychopharmaceutical Pluralism in India, published in 2013, and a forthcoming publication titled Living Worth, Value and Values in Global Pharmaceutical Markets, as well as many journal articles on the intersections between health and economics. So we now welcome Dr. Stefan Ecks to be the first to deliver the talk for the first session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Okay, can you see my slides?
No, your slides are not visible yet.
Are they visible now?
Saurabhi, it is visible.
The slides are visible.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Slides are visible?
They are
okay.
visible, yes.
Good. So thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to participate, to see some old friends again, at least in this online version. So today I'm gonna just continue basically from Anirban Das's ideas about negotiating the science question, and then I'm gonna go into sort of a value theory that I've been working on, and then I'm gonna go into a territory that I've never been before, which is Bollywood cinema, just to throw you off course entirely. So let me start. Anirban Das has already outlined, this negotiating the science question, these oppositions between what was laid in the Germany in the 19th century as Geisteswissenschaften versus Naturwissenschaften, the qualitative versus the quantitative. Value here, values as something that's incommensurable on the one hand, and then value as measurement, quantifiable, commensurable in the natural sciences. And what I'm trying to do is to develop a new theory of what I call embodied value that actually transcends all of these binaries. I lay this out in more detail in this book that's forthcoming, Living Worth, which is about really my years of research on the pharmaceutical industry in India, most of all. But really, in the course of writing this book, I was just working on the question of value much more generally. And value, as it turns out, is, of course, an absolute key concept in anthropology, which is my own home discipline. So even the oldest definitions of what anthropology is about the study of human conventions, values, as Benedict said, or Graeber wrote, we are studying values, symbolic system that defines the world in terms of what is important, meaningful, desirable, or worthwhile in it. So even these definitions and these conceptualizations of value in the social sciences always hit on that question of, are values commensurable or are they incommensurable? Can certain values be exchanged with each other, and what are value transformations? And the proposal I'm making in the book in much greater detail is that value is embodied life. So I'm coming from a notion of value, retracing it to the original meaning of the term in Latin, which is valere. And when you look at the whole etymology and the whole field of meaning of this term value, you find that it actually is immediately about embodied life and about health, right? So me being a medical anthropologist is actually not that far-fetched in terms of coming to this question of value. When you look in Latin, you would say vale as a greeting to be well, or valeo means I am healthy, worthy. In English, you say to wield, to be strong. So wielding and being strong in a bodily sense, and also in a mind, a strong mind is the sort of English derivative of value itself, of the Latin value. And lastly, also value is actually meaning itself, right? So verbum valet in Latin means the word means. So we have this incredible coagulation of embodied health, meaning, worth, and sort of something that's good, right? That's an obvious one also for value. So value is basically embodied life, and embodied life is value. And I'm going from there to the next point, that valuing is embodied always, right? So some of the key references, they come from some of the work that cognitive linguists such as Johnson, as of Lakoff and Johnson, of Metaphors We Live By, have developed, given the nature of our bodies, how and what we perceive, how we move, what we value, and the general surroundings of our dimensions of our surroundings. We will experience regular recurring patterns that afford us possibilities for meaningful interaction. And also Paul Ricoeur, Derrida's doctoral advisor, saying, you know, the need is the primordial spontaneity of the body. As such, it originally and initially reveals values. Before I will it, a value already appeals to me solely because I exist in the flesh. The first non-deductible is the body as existing, life as value, right? So this, in the history of philosophy, you can find an awful lot of really powerful ideas that basically say the same thing, that when you think about value, it is about embodiment in some form, and to bring out this embodiedness of value, and that valuing is always tied up with embodiment. This is what I'm trying to work through. And one of the discoveries of this value theory is that valuing in this formulation goes beyond humans, and it also goes beyond the humanities in this narrow sense, because it's actually all embodied beings value, right? So also animals and plants, and actually any living being that is embodied in some form or another is, by virtue of this embodiment, a valuing creature. You cannot not value, right? So one cannot not value, as a play on Václavic's idea about, you know, one cannot not communicate. In just the same way, one cannot not value. And the reason why one cannot not value is that the body brings with it these affordances of up is usually better than down, forward is better than going backward, right is usually better than left, light is better than dark, and so on. So you have always these deeply embodied dimensions of, you know, us having a certain kind of humans, for example, having a certain kind of body where the eyes are looking forward, which means that going forward is valued more highly than going backward, for example, or, you know, all of these valuations of high and up and so on being better than down and low and depressed. And you know, these valuations basically are grounded in an experience of having a certain kind of body. And again, what's important, Kohn also expressed this in his book on how forests think, is that this is not something, you know, once you turn to value as something that's embodied, you can see also that, again, animals and plants also value, because that's absolutely essential for being alive, means that you're valuing absolutely everything all the time. Then I develop various kinds of key dimensions also, and what value is relative to. So I'm working with this idea of individuals, as in, you know, what Marion Strathern and Donna Haraway have also talked about, meaning also that, and this is a key point that I'm going to develop a little bit in later with my example, is that, you know, it matters a lot whether you are valuing something as life enhancing for your own body, or if your body is somewhat you know, sort of where the boundaries between bodies are not quite as clear. And an obvious one is kinship, right? Kinship is a certain form of bodily co-substantiality that makes you value your own children, for example, more highly than other people's children, or you know, you know, you just value family more, basically. So this is individual, sort of going past this notion of the Western individual. Actually, is, once you dig more deeply into it, you find that even in so-called Western notions of the individual, you know, this individuality is never fully achieved. You know, everyone's individual all the time. This is not something that is specific to any particular culture. Other dimensions of value that make it relative are proximity, so a certain kind of spatial proximities. You usually value things that are close by more than things that are far away. Power differences are extremely important, right? So, even in terms of establishing the criteria for valuing power and status make a big difference. Time modulates transactions and valuations always. So is something valuable in this present moment, or is value something for a later point in time? Think Marcel Mauss and gift exchanges. This has been worked out very nicely, and also Bourdieu, of course. And then finally, inner worldly and outer worldly actualizations of value, which is a classic Max Weber question of, is this merit, or what I'm achieving, what the value that I'm creating in this world, can I use this and transform this into value in another world or not, right? So this actually comes back to these classic questions in Max Weber's comparative sociology of religions. So these are just a few points of this value theory. What I want to highlight now is another key component of this, which is that living means valuing, first of all, and then valuing is always a comparison, right? Any valuation is a comparison. And when you look at some of the analytic philosophies, such as Nelson Goodman's point that when you compare two items to each other, you can find infinite similarities between them. There's always, you can take a chair here and a tree there, and you will find, although they seem to be completely separate entities, you can say, well, they were both created on a Tuesday, or the weight of this object is similar to the other object, and so on and so forth. So basically, the possibilities of comparing two entities are absolutely endless. And that brings in this question of relevance. Relevance is, I'm going here with Heidegger, also what he developed in his Dasein analysis. Relevance literally means to relieve, to bring out of trouble. And basically it helps. Relevance is what helps you to establish whether one thing is more valuable than another, and it helps you to distinguish sort of what criteria in this comparison is actually important or not. So relevance is decided by whether it is good or bad for life in this embodied form. And just two more, points here from Wolff and from Barnes, Bloor, and Henry. Living beings must decide to live. So everything is always a decision and a valuation, and the relevance comes from whether it enhances life or not, whether it's good for life or not. And living beings must decide what is correct and what is not, because that's the condition of being an embodied living being. And now I want to move to, from this understanding of an embodied action as valuing to understanding narrative, right? This is a new book project that I have, which is looking at valuing and value theories that are expressed in movies. So also reading Alain Badiou on this. Movies are philosophical experiments, and the narration that they entail is what makes the postulates, sort of these ideas about really ontology and how the world works and what is important, what is valuable and what is not, what makes this implicit. And so basically what I'm trying to do in this new project is to use this notion of embodied value and move it to the analysis of movies. And one of the movies that I'm looking at is Om Shanti Om, which is a Bollywood movie from 2007. I'm sure that you all know this movie also, but if you don't know, very briefly, the plot is there is an aspiring actor, Om, falls in love with star actress Shanti, but she's already secretly married to producer Mikey. Shanti wants the marriage and her pregnancy to be public. Mikey says that no one will invest even a penny in a married actress film. And he burns down the set of this film that they were about to make, Om Shanti Om, and then buries Shanti half alive underneath the set. Om dies trying to save Shanti from the fire, but he does not know, so he knows that Shanti died in the fire, but he does not know that evil Mikey actually buried her body underneath the set. He's reincarnated as Raj, son of a star actor. 30 years later, Raj is also a star. He comes back to the burned film set for a new film, and then those ruins trigger Raj to remember his former life and Shanti's murder. Raj hedges a plan to resurrect the production of this Om Shanti Om film that was aborted back then, in order to push Mikey to reveal his crime, right? This is a very Hamlet Shakespearean plot, actually. And in the final showdown, Shanti's ghost avenges her death by killing Mikey. Her soul at peace, she dissolves. How much time do I have left, Subro? No, I'll just continue.
Yeah, so you can continue for a while.
How much time do I have left? I've sort of lost track.
Another 7 to 10 minutes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, good. So basically, this is one of those crucial scenes here. This is in this ballroom just on the set of this movie in the 1970s that was then aborted and not made. So Shanti Mittal has already invested 4 million rupees in this movie. And then he actually says, I think it's fair enough to kill you and to burn down the entire film set because, the investment, you turned out to be, you're my wife, but I never acknowledged this. And, you were just a very bad investment. And to killing her is sort of, I think it's fair enough, is his comment, which is, of course, incredibly cruel. So life, death, and karma are the key themes in this movie. And, when you just look at the whole story, there's a lot of different movies and bodies that are appearing in different versions of what it means to be alive or dead or half dead, or the body in different shapes and form, but also the whole question of mind-body dualism, the relationship between the mind or the soul and the body. So some of these I've listed here, it's about being alive or dead, or destructible, indestructible bodies or souls. They're co-substantial bodies in terms of families, lineages, in marriage, or being with child, because Shanti is also pregnant when she gets killed. There's the question of reincarnation, ghostly existence, reanimation, buried alive, which is a very, very bad death, basically. Aging and ageless bodies. So when we see Om return in his new life, he finds his mother and his friend and everyone still there, but basically in an aged form. Then there's a whole play on acting as embodying someone else. Impersonation is important. The question of medial representations of bodies as actually bringing bodies back to life. The movie is full of so-called cameo appearances of real Amitabh Bachchans within a fictional narrative. Youth to seniority changes, desiring other bodies, as in desiring in life or on screen. Buildings are like bodies, like clothing for bodies. So both the houses appear in this way and film sets appear in this way. And finally, body as evidence for the crime that was committed. And so this movie actually dramatizes legitimate and illegitimate conversions of value across different spheres, right? So some of them are legitimate and some of them are illegitimate. And basically the movie narrative strives towards reestablishing order and justice whenever there was a form of illegitimate conversion or an illegitimate action. And the most prominent one, of course, being Mikey killing Shanti because that's a form of illegitimate dispossession of Shanti's soul of Shanti's body. There are key moments, some film stills, which is this motif of life, death, and marriage. So you see, underneath this chandelier, first he's sort of, Mikey pretends that they're gonna get married underneath this chandelier, but then later on he gets killed by the ghost of Shanti, making the chandelier fall onto him and killing him. So there's a sort of life and life-forming co-substantiality of bodies in marriage, which is then changed into killing the body of Mikey. Buildings appear like bodies. So here's the house of that, when Om is in the 1970s, and then there's this house, and he says, I will move into this house of superstar actor Kapoor, which he actually then later does. And there are these moments of where the film set is burned down and resurrected, right? So there's a film still of the film set. Love makes life endure is a theme that recurs. A man who gives his heart loses his life, but does he really die is one of the dance numbers. There's death, failed reanimation, and rebirth of Om. And this still on the left side shows this, in his first life, Om had Om tattooed on his arm, and in his reincarnated body, Om is still there as a trace on his arm, so that he never really, that this, even the bodily form actually continues through the transmigration of soul. The rebirth and individuality theme is really interesting because the movie asks who are his real parents, right? So he acknowledges the superstar actor that he's reborn into as his father, but also that he later acknowledges that his previous mother is still his mother. Lots of references to the value of marriage and love establishing a shared body. So this thing, how do you know the worth or the value of a pinch of vermilion as, a key symbol of marriage that recurs again and again. I think it's not even just 3 key scenes in the movie where this comes up, but even more than that. Acting and representing as a form of reincarnation comes up. So in one of those scenes at the Filmfare Awards, one of those producers says a good actor is a person who brings out somebody else's soul into his soul. So again, acting is actually a form of reincarnation. Mind over matter is a theme. So he says, when you really, really want something, the universe will give it to you. So if you will it in your mind, matter will follow. Representations themselves appear as reincarnations of various forms. Both, sometimes the reincarnation is only in the ghostly body, but also in in any kind of photographic or media form. And finally, the body of evidence question, which is then the resolution of the movie, where Mikey says that without this evidence, if you don't know where the body of Shanti is, even God can touch me. So you will not get me, or justice will not be done. But then the ghost of Shanti enacts the justice by both revealing that her body, the body of evidence, is buried underneath the film set, and also then kills Mikey with this chandelier. So to round off, the theory that's really expressed here, there's 2 versions of this. So the first one is all very familiar to you, which is Bhagavad Gita and Indian philosophy of transmigration of souls in samsara, as the re-embodiment of a still desiring soul into another body. And this is the passage that Om describes. And the other passage, which is Shanti's passage, is moksha, is a liberation from bodily rebirth, for a soul that it goes beyond desire. Again, you can find many references to this in the Gita and elsewhere. So the very final scene of the movie is Shanti's ghost is at peace and dissolves into, so she was just hanging on to this world in this ghostly half state while justice hadn't been done, and then in the end she can resolve. She's at peace. Shanti, of course, meaning peace precisely. So there's these two versions of what you can become and the relationship of souls to embodiment. And again, so here we come back to this embodied value theory, which is basically that only embodiment establishes what's valuable and what is relevant. Only as an embodied being can you say this is good or this is bad, because it has to be relevant for life, both your individual life, but also your individual life that you're sharing with close others. And what the movie actually does is it thinks through these diverse forms of embodiment and argues that a desiring or a valuing soul will seek rebirth in a new body, and the non-desiring soul, which is Shanti's, needs no body and can resolve. So basically what I'm saying is that Bollywood cinema has thought of this embodied value theory long before I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ecks, for this wonderful presentation and wonderful talk. Well, I would like now to invite Dr. Malaspina to deliver her comments on this wonderful talk. Dr. Malaspina, please. Dr. Malaspina, are you here?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
I'm sorry, I've had terrible problems of connections. Thank you very much.
Yes, we apologize for the technical glitches and difficulties. Please.
Yeah, the problem here was on my side. I had no connectivity for a reason that I don't understand. Sorry, Paul, just a moment. It's a little interruption as well. I thank you very much for this beautiful paper, and apologies for not having been present earlier to introduce you. And I was really fascinated with your talk because I'm interested in medieval theories of individuation at the moment, researching a little bit on other aspects of reading Gilbert Simondon, who's a philosopher that I'm very interested in. And this idea of embodiment that was really entrenched in modern European philosophy, where the question of individuation was basically closed. And the idea was that all that exists are individuals. And the way that this has been interpreted often on the surface is to say that everything that exists is an entity or a thing. But it also means to a certain extent that to deny the whole wealth of what the medievals, the virtual worlds, all the individuals that exist in intellectum, that exist in the mind, and to say that individuality is something that needs hexaity in existence. So unless you exist, you are not an individual. There is no, and consequently, obviously, no value can be attributed to it. For a philosopher like Simondon, for instance, that's not the case. I think that he returns in a way to this wealth of virtual individuals as well, because he thinks that there is an analogy, that you can use a method to individuate in thought as in experience you participate in the individuation of objects around you or of collectivities and so forth. So I was wondering if there is a philosophical setting within which you contextualize to a certain extent this question of individuality in re, so in empirical existence, and individuality in intellectu, which would be the kind of existence in the mind, or individuality and value of something in the mind, leaving angels aside for now. Sorry, I hope it's not coming in too heavy here. I've been struggling a little bit to follow your entire talk with interruptions of connectivity and feeling a little bit nervous.
No, thank you very much. It's really interesting. And of course, there's such a wealth of possible ways of just spinning this further. I mean, one of the main starting points for me is also basically, this has been, so I'm coming from this also, an anthropology of India. And a classic point has always been this individuality, right? So the points that Marilyn Strathern and Donna Haraway were making later actually, were first formulated by McKim Marriott in the 1970s already. Basically, this idea that in India, both minds and bodies are actually completely partible and individual, right? And then back then it was still sort of an opposition that this is sort of a typically Hindu philosophy, where as opposed to the West, but actually the point that I think is extremely clear, particularly, once you get your head off that weird self-deception of much of Western philosophy that, the individual is actually the core of the thinking being, that you find that individuality is the full condition of being for everyone, basically. And you find this much more clearly articulated than later in phenomenology and in even Heidegger and all sorts of people. So it's the philosophical argument can be made towards saying that individuality has been around for much longer, and that we've never been individuals, basically. And I think that this is something that one can really learn and just then really rediscover what you're also saying, in terms of medieval philosophy, that there's probably much more there in terms of saying that there's thinking about individuality. And the point that you're raising about the mind versus matter question, in a way, right? So ideas and the intellectual on the one hand, and then material objects on the other. That's another thing that I'm working through in much greater detail in the book, which is about, for me, value theory is precisely going beyond this opposition of the spiritual and the material altogether, because valuing is the embodied life. So the value is something that is deeply is an idea as much as it gets, right? And it's something that you would also be able to express in thinking, but it's actually also as fleshy, embodied as it gets. And so to that extent, I'm trying more to think beyond those divisions also. And this value theory is actually trying to show that if you really want to understand what valuing means, then you have to go beyond the mind-body distinction as well, right? And I'm trying to show that how this is possible.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the questions that might be coming in. I don't have
ma'am, there aren't any questions for the time being. So I guess we can, if there is no more question from your side, we can proceed directly with the next speaker. All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Ecks, for this wonderful talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay, whose talk is on narrative medicalization of the human psyche and literary modernism. Now, to introduce Dr. Chattopadhyay briefly, he is Assistant Professor of Literary Studies in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar, India. He is a BA, MA, MPhil in English Literature from Presidency College and Jadavpur University, India. He has written his MPhil thesis on Samuel Beckett and Ala Badiou and finished his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. He has been published in books like Deluge and Beckett, Knots, Post-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Literature and Film, Gerald Murnane, Another World in This One, etc. And journals such as Textual Practice, Interventions, Samuel Beckett Today, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Sound Studies, and the Harold Pinter Review. He has co-edited the book Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature, and has guest edited the SBT/A issue on Samuel Beckett and the Extensions of the Mind. Orko is the chief editor of the online literary journal Shonglap. His first monograph, Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real, has been published by Bloomsbury in 2019. He's currently finishing co-editing a volume on Nobarun Bhattacharya for Bloomsbury, India, slated for 2020, and working on another volume on Badiou and modernism. So I now invite Dr. Chattopadhyay to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon to the panel, the chair. It was very interesting listening to let's say, the dialectics of science and humanities, and then the question of embodiment of value. I may not necessarily go in those directions, but I do have some interest in corporeality as well as philosophy of mathematics in general, and philosophy of mathematics as it gets enacted through Lacanian psychoanalysis. But that's not exactly what I will be talking about. To jump straight into the talk, the fundamental question I will try and ask in this talk is, how is a human psyche medicalized? And especially, how is a human psyche medicalized as a narrative? So the idea of psyche as a narrative, and then a question of medicalizing that psyche. So first and foremost, we have to make a distinction here between medicalization and pathologization. When we say medicalizing a psyche, we are talking about a human psyche in the context of medicine, in the context of medical practices, clinical communications, and so on. It's not a pathologization of the psyche, which is a different ballgame altogether, right? And it has its own problematic dimensions. So I will be concentrating more on this medical dimension of the psyche as a narrative. I think we've already heard, unfortunately, because of technical glitches, I could not join yesterday, but I did join for Professor Das's talk, and we've already had an introduction to the field of medical and health humanities, so I wouldn't necessarily belabor that. But to talk about two very brief moments in the development of medical humanities and literature specifically, and that too modernist literature of the 20th century, let me talk about, at least mention, we may not get the time to go deep into this, but mention the work of Rita Sharon and the idea of narrative medicine that she brought into the practice of medicine, more than the practice of literature. So Sharon, as most of you would know, was a medical doctor who decided to study literature, did a PhD on Henry James, and was quite instrumental in late 90s and early 2000s especially to introduce narrative pedagogy for students of medicine. And since then, there have been other medical humanities thinkers and theorists like Alan Bleakley, who have talked about this idea of medical culture, a linguistic culture that is constructed around medicine. We will say a little bit more about writing, not necessarily the linguistic culture in a sense of medicine as a cultural practice, but more about literary writing as a kind of autotherapy. But I wanted to mention another neurobiologist who has often engaged with philosophy, somewhat rarely, one must say. And this is Antonio Damasio. I'm thinking of Antonio Damasio and his formulation of the human self into the three categories: the proto-self, what he calls the proto-self, which is in a way, one could say, the primordial feelings, the primordial affective self of the human subject. Then we have a core self, which is to a certain extent given, but then the most important of the three for Damasio is what he calls the autobiographical self. So this autobiographical self, as the word autobiographical, which is quite literary, already suggests, this third self is a construction, and it's a narrative construction. So within medical humanities, I would like to pose Damasio's notion of autobiographical self as a medicalization of narrative psyche, medicalization of psyche as a narrative. Because this autobiographical self is narratively constructed by the human subject through, of course, very complex social, political, cognitive experiences. Now, with these two very brief sort of moments in medical humanities in mind, let us go and talk more about literature, and in a very specific sense, what one could call narrative therapy. But before that, another question which would divide the two parts of my paper, where I would talk about two different texts, possibly three, but I don't think we'll get the time, but we can perhaps have a discussion on it if there are questions. So is medical psyche, when we understand medical psyche in literature, instantiations of medical psyche in literature, the question I'm asking is that medical psyche contextual or textual? So what we see in Sharon's work and a lot of other medical humanities work is a deep interest in what is called pathography, illness narratives or pathography. So how does a patient talk about their symptoms, their illness, their experience of that illness as a sort of imprint on their body and mind, which may not be that clearly distinguishable in any case? So this question of the pathography or illness narrative is again quite central to a lot of medical humanities work around literature. But what we also see here is a literary embedding of this question, in the sense that literature is an illness narrative, or has always been an illness narrative to a certain extent. Much before the construction of medical humanities as a field of inquiry or research. But having said that, what I would briefly do is to mention at least one, if not two texts, which go against the conventional idea of a pathography. So the conventional idea of a pathography is the patient's narration, though we do get the voice of the doctor. For example, one of the pathographies which is often discussed in medical humanities is the pathography of Oliver Sacks after he had a very bad accident. And Oliver Sacks, as you know, is a medical doctor, he's a psychologist. So we do have the doctor's voice there as well, but pathography is often understood as a narrative that comes from the side of the patient. If not the patient, it could also be the family, the survivors, in case of a death narrative. We would talk about two instances of pathography where the medical intern is writing a medical report, a report of observation, observing a patient. But it becomes a pathography in the sense that the patient's narrative comes to the fore through the narrative of the doctor. That's the one and perhaps more self-evident sense in which it becomes a pathography. But where the genre code of pathography gets twisted is that, in a way, the medical intern, I'm using a gendered term because in this narrative, the medical intern is a he, the medical intern himself becomes a patient. And these hard distinctions between the one who's observing and the one who's observed medically becomes untenable. So I'll begin with this text and then go on to another one. The text that I have in mind, and again, I will primarily work with modernist texts, partially because that's my field of specialization and expertise, but also because the medical questions become very particularly pertinent for the psychically sort of oriented modernist narratives in literary traditions, as we know. There's a very strong sense of interiority there. But this text, the text that I have in mind, and I will be talking about two somewhat peripheral texts, even though the writers are quite well known, but not that they're always canonically studied in the mainstream of modernism. So the first writer is Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian writer Thomas Bernhard, and the novel that I will very briefly talk about is the 1963 novel he wrote titled Frost in the English translation. So in this novel, we see a medical intern who's observing his instructor, his doctors, I mean, the doctor with whom he's an intern, his doctor's quote unquote mad brother, who's a painter. He's a painter, and quite interestingly, throughout the novel, we have this sense of confusion because of the overabundance of the surname or the family name that has been used. So both his medical master, the intern's medical master, and the painter are simply called Strock, which is the surname. And he goes to this particular village called Weng, and he doesn't quite like it. He also has to hide the fact that he's a medical intern. He has been asked to do that. He cannot reveal this at any cost. And this is an investigation of the so-called mad painter that has been imposed on him by his medical master. So from the very beginning, the novel is extremely attentive to what we could call the power dynamics of this clinical communication, the medical communication and the medical relationality. Again, someone like Alan Bleakley has written quite a bit on what he calls the patient-driven therapy or the patient-driven medicine, tweaking the power rhetoric, which generally lies with the doctor, the diagnostic rhetoric that lies with the doctor. So there is a diagnostic mission here, and the intern is supposed to diagnose the particular kind of madness that this particular painter has. Now, one tweaking that the novel does, and I'm going to make a very general point here, is that it presents absolute interiority and self-enclosure as a kind of madness, which is already a very interesting cynical jibe at the so-called inward turn of high modernism. Of course, this inward turn has been complicated by more recent scholars on modernism who have also agreed and argued with very strong basis that the so-called inward turn in a writer like Virginia Woolf is not simply absolute interiority. In fact, there's a very strong materialist dimension to that interiority that certain scholars have talked about, primarily in the context of the archive, talking about the stuff of fiction, this expression that Virginia Woolf would use. And Virginia Woolf is an important figure here because she's also someone who has written about illness quite explicitly in non-fictional form as well. But to come back to the point, Strock is an example of interiority as madness, but absolute interiority, I should add, not just any kind of interiority. So a self-enclosed notion of the psyche is tantamount to a mad psyche. This is one medical diagnostic derivation one could make from this novel. But I'm more interested in the way in which this novel inverts the power rhetoric of a pathography and becomes a very ironic kind of a pathography, because this is supposed to be a diagnostic report. In fact, throughout the book, and this is the book, if you can see, The Frost. So throughout the book, we have this day-by-day quotidian description of the painter. But as we move along, there is one particular insight that becomes very important in the book, and that is, what one could call a certain kind of transfer. I'm not going to use the more psychoanalytically loaded word transference, but a transfer of symptoms between the two, such as, for example, some of them are organic physical symptoms as well, such as headache. Also, this movement from a deep investiture in walking to a realization that all walking is absolutely pointless. So we see the medical intern, to put it radically, become the painter as the novel proceeds. And we also see this in terms of a certain, I would say, a machinery of quotation that becomes more and more apparent. Now, it's obvious that in a diagnostic observational medical report, there would be quotes of the person who is being observed. But what becomes interesting is that slowly the symptoms that the Dr. Strock had instructed our medical intern to observe in the painter Strock start getting manifested in some way in the intern himself. The novel ends with this sudden disappearance of the painter in the middle of the frost. In the peak of winter, he is not to be found after that. But this notion of the intern becoming Strock is what I want to dwell on. And again, for paucity of time, let me just pick out one moment from the novel. And deliberately, I am not using PowerPoints because I wanted to, in a way, test the listening skills of all of us, which have kind of diminished over the months and years, I suppose. Also because listening is one of those very important themes in medical humanities, not just in psychotherapy, also in, again, the Rita Sharonian sort of vision of medical humanities and narrative therapy and narrative medicine, which is very much about listening to the stories of the patients. So we have this particular moment. Let me just read out from the book here. This is towards the end of the book, and the narrator, the medical intern, has this feeling that he's not himself anymore. He says, I'm no longer myself. No, I thought I'm no longer myself. It drove me wild. This violence was a sudden induration against which I kept banging my head. But isn't that metaphor, that sensation in my brain, isn't everything I think and see and speak and revile, isn't it all Strock's? In the afternoon, I tried to sleep and I couldn't. I saw myself helpless and entrapped in sentences and perspectives of Strock's, in his morbidities and absurdisms. I continually heard myself blurt out the man's phrases. So there's a very strange incorporation of psyche that is happening, an incorporation of symptomatic psyche as a narrative, from one person to another, from the patient in this case to the medical intern. So I'll end this part of the talk by just drawing attention to this inversion and the inverted transfer that happens. There's another story, a more recent one by the contemporary American writer Brian Evenson that I wanted to talk about, but I don't think I have enough time for that. We can come back to this, but it's a very interesting short story called Internal, which is again about a similar medical observation. And the reason I will not perhaps go into it looking at the time now is that it has some similarities, in fact, a lot of similarities with Frost. There's an aspect of difference here which we might come back to if we have the time. But I do want to talk about a different text here and a different set of questions that are opened up there. So in this particular brief excursus through Frost, what we realized was medicalization of the psyche was part of the text, was part of the thematic contour of the text. Now, let me talk about another writer, Helen Emily Woods, who was born in 1901 and died in 1968. Some of you would be familiar with her works. She's more famous as Anna Kavan. Now, Helen Emily Woods was her actual name, and it's only in the collection titled Asylum Peace in 1940, a collection of short stories, that she started using this literary pseudonym for the first time, Anna Kavan. And interestingly, and this has been much commented by her biographer, as well as the literature that exists on Kavan's work, this name was the name of a recurring character in her initial novels. So Helen decided to name herself after one of her recurring characters. As you can see, there's already a certain narrative self-construction at work here. And it starts happening after her institutionalization. When she's institutionalized, primarily because of being unable to control her addiction to heroin and other mental health issues, after she comes back from the asylum, this is the collection she writes, Asylum Peace, where she calls herself Anna Kavan. From that point onwards, everything she writes is in the name of Anna Kavan. So we already have this act of renaming the self, which is a narrative act of medicalization of the psyche, because we are talking about a character that she picks out from her work and decides to become, as it were, after her medical institutionalization. So with Kavan's work, what we find very interesting is that, and that's why I will not talk about Asylum Peace, because Asylum Peace and I Am Lazarus, these collections talk about the institution. Again, there's a lot of work that exists on Kavan and other modernist writers who deploy various metaphors of technology and machinery to give voice to a certain notion of psychosis. I won't get into that particular track. Let me very briefly, for whatever time I have, talk about her, perhaps her most famous novel, the novel that she wrote before she passed away, 1 year before she passed away, 1967, a novel called Ice. Now, there has been, the predominant way of reading this novel, which is a very strange novel about this man who is looking for an ice maiden of sorts, this strangely hallucinatory girl who is constantly represented as white and conflated with climate crisis in the novel. She's also conflated with the whiteness of the ice, the walls of ice that are there to destroy the world. Now, the one way in which her novel, this particular novel, has been read is that it has been primarily interpreted as an allegory of substance abuse, where the whiteness of heroin, the drug, and by the way, she died in 1968 of an overdose. She was found with a syringe in her hand and with a lot of heroin in the apartment. Famously, the police said that much heroin could wipe out the whole street, not just her. So this particular, but there's also quite a bit of literature that critiques this medical fetishization of her work. So let's also be mindful of that. Let me draw out one particular point that I want to make about this very complex book, which cannot be discussed like this. But I want to talk about the question of the subject of addiction. Who is the subject of addiction? And I'm drawing on the work of Lacanian psychoanalyst Rick Luce, who wrote this book, The Subject of Addiction, in 2002. Now, Luce makes this argument about addiction being addiction. And it's not just a wordplay. In fact, it's not his invention. It's a term that was used before him by Rosenbrock and other medical practitioners as well. So addiction is hyphenated, and addiction as a hyphen diction represents the fundamental conflictuality between drug abuse and expression of drug abuse. So one of the central points that Luce talks at length in this book about is this complex relationship between language and substance abuse. Intrinsically speaking, substance abuse and language are not related to one another, which is what makes their extrinsic relation, situational, contextual relation more interesting. And Lewis also sort of highlights this irony that on the one hand, the one who suffers from drug addiction often struggles to talk about it, struggles to write it even more. But on the other hand, there is this, as I said, extrinsic situational relation between language and the substance as such. And this is established through a very complex Lacanian analysis in the book, where he talks about language as the field of the significant others and various relationalities with those others generating the question of addiction for a subject, because addiction is not a subjective structure for psychoanalysis. It's a phenomenon and it's also a symptom, but it's not necessarily a structure of the subject. So that's why the book is titled The Subject of Addiction, as I say. So in this particular novel, there has been a lot of discussion about the way this novel generates this apocalyptic world of climate crisis, climate migration, and all these others in relation to the narrator who turn out to be different aspects of the same self. So there's a sort of a psychotic fragmentation of the self and a sort of multiplication. We have this character, as I said, this white girl, the ice maiden, to use a cliche. Obviously, it's not that Cavan would particularly like the use of this cliche, but we also have this other enigmatic character, representative of this Kafkaesque figure of the law, the warden. And what's very interesting is how the medical dimension of this name, the character is never named throughout the book, how the medical dimension becomes militarized. So we realize this is also a novel that talks about climate war, literally war of the nations because of climate crisis. So in this novel, this warden becomes almost a global dictator, and to the point that the pun and the let's say the morphological break in that word does not sound so silly. We are talking about a shelter during war den. But what is very interesting is how the medical dimension of this particular term, warden, is almost entirely taken out. And what we have is this military dimension. The complex ice metaphor in the book has often been suggested that this ice metaphor represents the heroin addict's condition, and in that case this allegory becomes the indirect way of expressing the condition of substance abuse. Again, the as I said, addiction as addiction. So the indirection is what the literary allegory produces here. But let me finish with this. I don't think I have a lot of time, but let me finish with this one point that I want to make about the question of the world of this novel. So what is the world of this novel? This has often been discussed. Is it an environmental world? Is it a psychical world? Is it both? Is it none? What is happening in this novel? And again, just to give some contextuality to this, Anna Kavan had not just been in various psychiatric wards and hospitals in Switzerland and in other places too, in England too. She was also in a psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And even the other point which deserves a mention here is that she also wrote a book, a very cryptic novel titled The Horse's Tale, another allegory, with her own analyst, her German analyst, Karl Theodor Bluth. And Bluth was a co-writer with Cavan on this particular book. But to come back to Ice and to come back to this question of the world, what is a psyche? One of the suggestions offered by this novel is the psyche is like an environment too, because the novel very complexly conflates the end, the termination of the psyche with the termination of the human environment. So my world, the world of the narrator, and the world in some, let's say, objective visage, the world outside, are often conflated. So if we had this idea of absolute interiority as madness in the other novel we discussed, Frost, here we have this absolute permeability of the two worlds, the world of the interior and the world of the exterior. And what we have is this very interesting configuration of psyche as environment, psyche as an ecology. And I think I will end with that. I don't know if I have any time. Do I have any time at all?
Dr. Chattopadhyay, I guess a minute more.
Okay,
we're
sure,
already running
sure.
late.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just make one final observation, because again, I mean, I understand that it's very difficult to talk about these novels if one hasn't read them beforehand. So this is a novel written in a very hallucinatory, unreal style, and which is why she has often been compared with Kafka, and rightly so, perhaps. So what we have here is a certain narrativization of delusion and substance abuse leading to a certain kind of delusion. But what I'm trying to say, I guess, in both these readings, and this will be the last sentence, is that these are attempts to write the psyche, not necessarily of the author himself, but sometimes in case of Anna Kavan, perhaps there's an authorial dimension here as well. But these are attempts to write the symptom. And now when I'm using the word symptom, I'm using it in a more Lacanian sense. Symptom as Santon, following the late Lacan of Seminar 23 and so on, where symptom is something that we construct through analysis. It does not pre-exist the clinical process of psychoanalysis. Symptom is constructed intersubjectively by both the analysand and the analyst together as a construction that comes out of psychoanalysis, the process of analysis, as and when it comes to some sort of an end. So we are talking about this writing the symptom as a construction, which is an act of therapy in itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for the wonderful talk. And I request Dr. Cecil Malaspina to please give her valuable comments on this talk. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much. This have been two really fascinating talks back to back, and very well curated to have both of you on the same panel. I hope that we can get a conversation going here. One of the things that occurred to me to connect your talk with the previous talk is this notion of substance abuse, because I guess one of the biggest problems in early modern philosophy, modern European philosophy, that is related to this is the idea that the mind is an infinite substance in itself, and that the body is an infinite substance. So the problem was, how do two infinite substances communicate without limiting each other, which would be a paradox. And I wanted to read you a really delightful, quite literary quote from Leibniz. It's just one sentence here. He says, "When I began to think about the union of the soul with the body, it was like casting me back into the open sea. For I found no way to explain how the body causes anything to take place in the soul, or vice versa, or how one substance can communicate with another created substance. So far as we can know from his writings, Descartes gave up on the struggle over this problem." So this just I thought it was a humorous way to think about substance abuse as the problem of psychosomaticity, at least in our corpus of thinking, which is the idea that there is a constant abuse of the body abusing the psyche, if you take heroin, for instance, or the other way around, the mind abusing the body, so that you have doctors who have patients whom they can't help because they have very elaborate psychosomatic symptoms that are real, but at the same time that cannot be cured according to the knowledge of some of the kind of physiological causes that the doctors know. I think I'm going to leave the floor open to other questions coming in. I have a lot of other things to say. I thank both of you for very engaging talks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Malaspina. Now, there are, as of now, a couple of questions in the chat box. So, but due to time constraints, we shall be taking one at the moment. So the question is from Shubro Parui. And the question is, when we talk about literature here, pathography has its limitation. So the question is, does pathography have its limitation? Or any graphic medicine can be considered as a part of the literature?
Any graphic medicine, was it?
Yes, that's what it's said here. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. So let me be very brief. I know we've run out of time, but just a one-sentence response to what Professor Malaspina said there, because it's very interesting, that question of body as substance, because in contemporary post-Lacanian psychoanalysis, when and let me just simplify this, when we talk about the body, quite often we talk about this sort of disjuncture between speech and body, and how speech doesn't quite sit pretty on the body. So the speech, the act of speech is also something that abuses the body. So speech as a material substance that abuses the body could also be thought through in this particular context. Thank you so much for that. About the question, yes, I mean, the whole point of deconstructing the idea of pathography through a literary text, which is the doctor's report, but eventually becomes a pathography of sorts, is to draw attention to the limitation of pathography as a clinical form when it comes to literature. Having said that, we could, of course, say more about this, about questions of witnessing. There are texts. I mean, for example, sickbed narrative has been a literary subgenre for a long, long time. And there are also narratives, for example, I'm thinking of Simone de Beauvoir's narratives on her mother's death, when she witnesses her mother's death. And there are multiple sort of memoirs and reminiscences where she talks about how she saw her mother die. So again, there are lots of complications we could introduce to the genre code of the pathography as an illness narrative within medical humanities, not necessarily in a literary sense a genre, but a genre in the medical sense. That's where I would stop, because I'm not quite sure if I understand the second part of the question.
All right, Dr. Chattopadhyay, I guess due to limitation of time, we need to end this plenary session here. I thank Dr. Stefan Malaspina for chairing this session, and I thank Dr. Stefan Ecks and Dr. Chattopadhyay for the wonderful, wonderful talks. We